October 20th, 1944. The Philippine island of Leyte. This was the moment the world was waiting for, an image crafted for history. General Douglas MacArthur wading ashore through the warm Pacific surf, fulfilling a promise that had become a national obsession. 2.5 years earlier, in the dark spring of 1942, he had been forced to flee these islands by submarine and PT boat, leaving his starving men on Bataan and Corregidor to a horrifying fate of death marches and prison camps. Uttering a defiant three-word vow that echoed across the globe, "I shall return." Now, under the watchful eyes of newsreel cameras that had been carefully positioned for the perfect shot, that promise was kept. He stepped onto the beach, a living symbol of American resolve, and delivered a speech from a portable radio transmitter that was part prayer, part prophecy. "People of the Philippines, I have returned. By the grace of Almighty God, our forces stand again on Philippine soil, soil consecrated by the blood of our two peoples." It was a moment of supreme triumph, a masterfully staged piece of political theater meant to signal a swift and glorious liberation. But the promise of redemption would soon be swallowed up by a reality of ruin. MacArthur, a man of immense ego and equally immense strategic vision, believed the fight for the Philippines would be a lightning campaign, a triumphant march back to his pre-war penthouse suite at the Manila hotel. Instead, his crusade would descend into one of the most brutal, vicious, and tragically forgotten struggles of the Second World War. His quest to liberate a city he loved would lead directly to its utter annihilation, and the triumphant return would climax in a month-long, street-by-street fight to the death in a charnel house of horrors that would rival the worst urban battles of the Eastern Front. This is the story of the battle for Manila, the forgotten hell of the Pacific War. The campaign began on Leyte, and from the very beginning, MacArthur's grand timetable began to unravel. The monsoon rains arrived early, turning the landscape into a quagmire of impassable mud. The airfields he desperately needed to project power became unusable swamps, and a fanatical Japanese defense turned what was meant to be a rapid victory into a brutal contest of attrition. The Japanese commander, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, the infamous Tiger of Malaya, who had conquered Singapore in a brilliant campaign, had been given a doomed command. A towering, imposing figure, he arrived from Manchuria to find a disorganized and ill-equipped force. His assessment was bleak and fatalistic. "So, it's come at last, has it? Well, my going won't change anything. It's my turn to die, isn't it?" Yamashita, a master of defensive strategy, had wanted to fight the decisive battle on the main island of Luzon, trading the vast island space for American blood and time. But under intense pressure from his superiors in Tokyo, who were still obsessed with the idea of a single, decisive naval battle, he was forced to feed his precious reserves into the meat grinder of Leyte. For months, in the island's rugged, jungle-choked mountains, American GIs fought a desperate, almost invisible enemy who had everything to die for. By the time the island was declared secure on Christmas Day, 1944, a declaration that was itself wildly premature as thousands of Japanese soldiers continued to fight on. The stage was set for the main event, the invasion of Luzon. But the bloody, grinding fight for Leyte was a dark omen of the horror that was to come. For the Japanese soldiers left behind, cut off from supply, starvation and madness took hold. One private, captured months later, wrote of the utter futility of his sacrifice. To lose one's life in a war of this kind is truly regrettable. My hatred for the army hierarchy is stronger than I can express. The things we did in China are being done to us. Japan will soon be defeated. With a bloody foothold secured, MacArthur's eyes turned to the ultimate prize, Manila. But first, he gazed out from the bridge of the cruiser USS Nashville at the coast of Bataan and the fortress island of Corregidor, the scenes of America's most humiliating defeat in 1942. The memory of that loss, of the men he had left behind, haunted him. I felt an indescribable sense of loss, of sorrow, of loneliness, and of solemn consecration. This was more than a strategic campaign for MacArthur. It was a personal crusade. He ordered his primary ground commander, the methodical, cautious, and brilliant General Walter Cruger, to conduct a lightning campaign. The plan was a massive amphibious landing at Lingayen Gulf, followed by a direct, high-speed thrust straight down the Central Plains to the massive airbase complex at Clark Field and on to Manila. But the two generals, men of vastly different temperaments, clashed immediately. MacArthur, relying on his famously optimistic and sycophantic intelligence chief, Major General Charles Willoughby, believed the Japanese on Luzon were a broken, demoralized force of barely 150,000 men. Cruger, a man who trusted his own instincts over political expediency, was deeply skeptical. He suspected a trap and rightly believed the number was far higher. Closer to 250,000, a formidable army fighting on its own turf. On January 9, 1945, Cruger's Sixth Army stormed ashore at Lingayen Gulf. The resistance on the beaches was, eerily, almost non-existent. General Yamashita had refused to contest the landings, pulling his forces back into his planned defensive zones. Within days, 150,000 American troops were on Luzon, a massive beachhead that was almost immediately aided by fiercely loyal Filipino guerrillas who emerged from the hills to act as scouts, saboteurs, and combat troops. The only real threat came from the sky, as the divine wind, the kamikaze, slammed into the invasion armada, turning ships into floating infernos. But as the American advance pushed inland, the lack of a major ground fight was deeply perplexing to the men on the front lines. One officer noted in his diary, "I still cannot make up my mind whether the Japanese are being stupid or rather bright." The advance south became a frustrating grind, not against a determined enemy, but against the terrain and the logistical nightmare of a destroyed country. With 217 bridges on the main highway to Manila systematically destroyed by the retreating Japanese, Cruger's progress was painstakingly slow, a fact that infuriated the impatient MacArthur, who demanded speed above all else. In late January, as the Sixth Army approached the massive complex of Clark Field and Fort Stutzenberg, MacArthur, eager for a headline, prematurely announced its capture. His subordinate on the ground, Lieutenant General Oscar Griswold, was furious at the deception. Japs hold Stotzenburg in strength, though General MacArthur has already announced its capture. Why does he do this? It took another 5 days of heavy, vicious fighting to secure the airfield, and 3 more weeks to clear the heavily fortified hills and caves surrounding it. But MacArthur's focus was singular, obsessive. To accelerate the push, he unleashed 2 flying columns from the 37th Infantry and 1st Cavalry Divisions. Powerful, mechanized assault groups of truck-mounted infantry, Sherman tanks, and mobile artillery, with one simple order: race for Manila. Photographer Carl Maidans, who rode with them, captured the chaotic, determined energy of the advance. Almost all the bridges were out, and we forded the rivers, the men holding their weapons high, while the trucks and the lumbering tanks pushed and pulled each other with engines screaming and water flying. But there was another, more desperate reason for MacArthur's urgency, a reason that kept his commanders awake at night. Scattered across Luzon were Japanese POW and internment camps, holding the last skeletal survivors of Bataan and thousands of Allied civilians who had been imprisoned since 1942. Their liberation was a race against time. The memory of the Palawan Massacre, where Japanese guards had herded American prisoners into trenches, doused them with gasoline, and burned them alive as U.S. forces approached, haunted the command. At the Cabanatuan POW camp, a daring, now legendary raid by U.S. Army Rangers, Alamo Scouts, and Filipino guerrillas rescued over 500 prisoners. The men they found were not soldiers. They were skeletal, disease-ridden ghosts of their former selves, men who had endured years of starvation and brutality. One rescuer described their reaction to seeing their well-fed, well-equipped liberators. They could not believe they had been released. Our equipment, helmets, and everything else were so foreign to them. They just thought we were men from Mars.
In early February, the flying columns reached the northern outskirts of Manila and liberated the Bilibid prison and the 3,000 civilian internees at Santo Tomas University. With the prisoners safe, MacArthur prepared for his victory parade, still hoping to capture the Pearl of the Orient, with its wide boulevards and beautiful Spanish architecture, intact. But the battle for Manila was about to begin, and it would unfold according to neither MacArthur's plans nor Yamashita's. General Yamashita, the Tiger of Malaya, never intended to fight in Manila. Knowing he couldn't hold the sprawling city against American air and artillery power, he declared it an open city, just as MacArthur had in 1941, and ordered his troops to withdraw to prepared defensive positions in the mountains to conduct a long, bloody insurgency. But one man defied that order: Rear Admiral Iwabuchi, commander of the Manila Naval Defense Force. A career battleship officer, Iwabuchi was a man haunted by the shame of losing his command, the battleship Kirishima, at Guadalcanal. Now, with a force of 12,500 sailors and 4,000 army troops, he saw a chance to redeem his honor in a final, glorious battle. He would disobey the army general's orders. He would fight to the death. He would transform the Pearl of the Orient into a fortress of death. Iwabuchi's men, though mostly inexperienced naval personnel, were heavily armed. They turned the city's sturdy, earthquake-resistant government buildings into concrete pillboxes. They mined major intersections with massive naval shells, set up machine gun nests in sewers, and constructed crenellated barricades with spaces for throwing grenades. As American forces approached, the Japanese unleashed a wave of terror on the civilian population that stands as one of the worst atrocities of the entire war. They torched entire districts, creating a wall of fire to slow the American advance. Under the guise of providing shelter, they herded thousands of Filipino men, women, and children into public buildings like the German Club, only to massacre them with grenades and machine guns or burn them alive. A Japanese soldier's diary revealed the cold, sickening logic they employed. Feb 7th, 1945. 150 guerrillas were disposed tonight. I personally stabbed and killed 10. Feb 9th. Burned 1,000 guerrillas to death tonight. At 1600 hours, all guerrillas were burned to death. The term guerrilla was a fiction. The victims were almost all civilians. At the Bayview Hotel, Japanese soldiers rounded up young women and subjected them to nights of repeated, systematic rape. The city became a hellscape of fire, murder, and torture, a place where civility had completely collapsed. As his troops began the grim task of fighting their way into this inferno, General Griswold requested air support to bomb the Japanese strongpoints. MacArthur, still dreaming of saving the beautiful city, refused to allow bombing and only reluctantly authorized artillery. Griswold was aghast, watching the city burn every night from the Japanese demolitions. MacArthur has visions of saving this beautiful city intact. He does not realize that the skies burn red every night as the Japanese systematically sacked the city. My private opinion is that the Japs will hold part of Manila south of the Pasig River until all are killed. The American GIs, completely untrained in urban combat, had to learn on the job. They developed improvised assault squads, small, self-contained teams of flamethrowers, automatic riflemen, and demolition specialists to take the city building by building, room by room. The fighting was savage, close-quarters combat of the worst kind. Admiral Iwabuchi's orders to his men were simple and suicidal. If we run out of bullets, we will use grenades. If we run out of grenades, we will cut down the enemy with swords. If we break our sword, we will kill them by sinking our teeth deep in their throats. To break the heavily fortified buildings, U.S. artillery had to be brought up to fire point blank, sometimes from less than 100 meters away, pounding structures like the post office and city hall with hundreds of 155mm high explosive shells. After 16 days of this brutal street-by-street slaughter, only one bastion remained, the ancient. On March 3rd, after a full month of brutal combat, MacArthur finally announced Manila was secure. His victory parade took place amidst the ruins of a completely devastated city. Over 1,000 Americans were killed and more than 5,500 wounded. Nearly 16,000 Japanese defenders died. But the greatest cost was borne by the city itself. An estimated 100,000 Filipino civilians were dead, slaughtered by the Japanese or killed in the crossfire of the battle to liberate them. The Pearl of the Orient was gone, a wasteland of rubble and corpses that rivaled the destruction of Stalingrad or Warsaw. The war in the Philippines did not end there. General Yamashita, a brilliant and determined commander, fought on from his mountain strongholds for another 6 months, tying down huge American forces until the final Japanese surrender in August 1945. He was later tried for war crimes, specifically for the atrocities committed in Manila by a subordinate who had defied his orders. In a controversial decision, a military court found him responsible for the actions of his troops and sentenced him to death. In his last statement, he accepted his fate with a stoic sense of duty. "The time has come to atone for my guilt with my death.
Various indelible stains that I left on the history of mankind cannot be offset by the mechanical termination of my life. The liberation of the Philippines cost nearly 16,200 American lives. Japanese losses were catastrophic, with some estimates as high as 500,000 dead, the vast majority from starvation and disease. Over 1 million Filipino civilians perished during the course of the war. Historians still debate the campaign. Some argue the islands should have been bypassed. Others claim MacArthur's monumental ego drove up casualties. But his defenders highlight his genuine, almost messianic desire to save the Filipino people, the POWs, and the civilian internees from the horrors of Japanese occupation. One of his staff members wrote, "MacArthur viewed the Allied return to the Philippines as something akin to the rescue of a beloved family member, an almost mystical moment of redemption and fellowship." Regardless of the controversy, the mission was complete. Manila was liberated, but it was a city of ghosts. The glorious return had descended into a forgotten hell, a brutal lesson in the horrific cost of urban warfare, and a tragedy that remains one of the darkest and most overlooked chapters of the Pacific War.